Hello and welcome to the last lecture of the semester for the online section of Business Ethics. Today we're going to be talking about the natural environment. Before we get into lecture, a few housekeeping things. Quiz 8 and Quiz 9 are going to be due at 11:55 on April 30th. The individual case assignment instructions and an example have been posted to As You Learn. The case assignment is going to be due May 8th on As You Learn. Also wanted to let you guys know for the current events, you have until the end of the semester, April 30th, to submit both of your current events. And exam 2 has been made and ready. It'll open on May 1st and close on May 8th. It's going to be the same format and style as exam 1, so you have 9 essay questions to choose from, and you'll answer 6 of those. It's going to be primarily focused on the content since exam 1, but be prepared and ready to apply ideas that were introduced over the whole semester. So things like applying ethical frameworks, biases, and some of the things that we talked about at the beginning of the semester, but applying them to some of the concepts we've discussed in the second half of the semester. So today's lecture is relatively short compared to some of the other lectures we've had this semester. We're going to be talking a little bit about defining environmental ethics, the orientation of values, unit of analysis. Then we'll talk briefly about the problem with wilderness, the interesting idea that was introduced by William Cronin in the Trouble with Wilderness reading you guys had. And then we'll finish up by talking about going green to gain a competitive advantage, focusing primarily on Reinhardt's 5 approaches to capturing value from environmental practices. So let's talk a little bit about environmental ethics. So the interesting thing about environmental ethics is there's multiple ways of understanding the human-environment relationship. The environment is somewhat different from other kinds of stakeholders in that we don't attribute preferences to the environment. We don't say that a rock likes to be hot or cold. A rock simply is. And this has very interesting implications to how we understand our responsibility or the ethical behavior as it relates to the environment. And so one thing that we can think about is the orientation of values. So one is to have a human-centered orientation of values, that the non-human environment exists for our use. And so this is a bit of the stewardship model. But we can also think about environmental ethics beyond human, that the earth and its creatures have a moral status beyond their instrumental value to humans and are worthy of our ethical concern. So we can think about the environment existing or our responsibility to the environment as it relates to how the environment works for us or what we want. But we can also think about the environment as having its own values separate from a human use. There's also issues of unit of analysis. So we can think about ethics in terms of at the individual level. So it focuses on individuals, whether human or not. So do we care about a specific species, or do we care about all species, which would be a holistic orientation where whole collections of individuals matter, and therefore the focus is on the group. Rather than an individual animal, then we can think about it at the species. We can also think about it at the ecosystem level or at the biome level, so the entire planet. And so these different orientations in unit of analysis, will influence what is the proper approach, regardless of the kind of ethical framework or tradition that we use. And I would suggest that you can be pro-environment under any of these orientations and unit of analyses. So, the important point here is that if you are human-centered, that doesn't necessarily mean that you are less or more ethical. It's a different orientation. So, at the human-centered individual level, we can think about an environmental ethic as I enjoy Grandfather Mountain, and so I protect it. If you have a beyond human orientation, but still at the individual level, Grandfather Mountain is a special place, so we protect it. If you have a non-human centered, it should be non-human centered but holistic, or excuse me, human centered but holistic, we can argue that humans depend on healthy ecosystems and the biome to survive and be happy, so I protect nature. So the reason for protecting the ecosystem, or the reason for caring about climate change, is because of the effect that it has on people. Alternatively, you can have a beyond human holistic orientation, which argues that ecosystems have intrinsic value, and so we protect them. And so this idea would take the kind of the complexity and the intricacies of ecosystems and saying that has value, separate from what humans benefit from. So, this idea that you can be pro-environmental under any of these orientations and unit of analyses, but what is right or wrong may change depending on how you're viewing the problem. And I would suggest that many of the debates about corporate environmental responsibility are debates of orientation and level of focus, not on the science behind them. That oftentimes when we talk about the science, the interesting thing is a lot of that discussion, I would suggest, is induced ambiguity and equivocality. And these are primarily used as strategies of delaying action. So we can view the climate change debate really as an understanding the science, the debate over the science is used as a way of delaying any action. And the reason why we're trying to delay action is because of different orientations. What do we, should we address these issues because of the effects that it's going to have on people? Should we address these issues because of the effect it's going to have on the planet? And these are different orientations. The other issue is that many global environmental problems have unknowable outcomes at useful levels of analysis. And so climate change is a great example of this, in that we can recognize that sea levels are going to rise over some measurable rate, but what that means for a specific building becomes incredibly difficult to model and predict. What it means for a specific community or a business becomes incredibly difficult to model and predict. And so, but there are some things that we do know. And so how these things play out, I think are very interesting, and a discussion for, a broader, course. The issue that I'm trying to push here is that in the businesses that you own and that you work at, that these decisions, that you have to make these sorts of decisions about what is it that I believe, and then develop an ethical framework that is based along those lines, and how you make decisions, and not get muddled, or not allow yourself to get lost in the ambiguities and lack of clarity on the science behind it. And this gets to I think an interesting idea, and I think one of the ideas I remember reading Cronin as an undergraduate environmental studies student, and was really kind of blown away by the arguments that he made, because it changed a great deal about what I understood as environmental protection, and that it kind of stood on its head a lot of things that for me I know I'd taken for granted. And so hopefully some of you all got the same enjoyment or head scratching that I got. But Cronin's argument is, he asks the question, what do we mean when we say we protect the environment? Protecting the environment from what? And ultimately, when we say we want to protect the environment, we're trying to say that we're protecting the environment from us. But the problem is, again, the environment as we understand it doesn't have preferences. The climate change story is quite interesting, because as many climate deniers have argued, the Earth has been much warmer during its history, and the Earth has been much colder during its history, and we haven't argued that was wrong or right. What is the right temperature for the Earth? the temperature of the Earth doesn't care what temperature it's at. So this idea that there's an ideal environment, planet, or temperature is very much I would argue, a human extension or an application of how humans understand the world on the environment itself. And Cronin comes to the conclusion that if the goal is to reduce human impact on the environment, then the logical conclusion is that we get rid of people. The only way that humans can have zero impact on the planet is to have no people. And that there are many species of animals that have significant impacts on the planet, but we don't talk about them being ethical. We don't talk about it being unethical when a beaver dams up a river and floods a drainage basin. That's just what beavers do. However, we have made that argument about people and the actions that people have. So I think the thing is Cronin's argument is that this idea of zero impact is both illogical and impractical. But what are firms supposed to do? How do we respond then to this ethic or this environmental ethic? And I would suggest it depends on your approach. It depends on your orientation. Now, for some of us, that might be going green to gain a competitive advantage. It might be going green to sustain resources for future generations, going green to sustain special places and species. Or it might be that you want to sustain the planet as it is. And so none of these approaches, I would argue, is inherently superior or inferior to the other, but they have different implications. Now, since this is a business class, we're going to be talking primarily about going green to gain a competitive advantage. And it asks this question: under what circumstances do particular kinds of environmental investments allow our firm to create value, some of which we can capture? And this, as the Porter and Kramer article that we read a couple of weeks ago talks about, it goes beyond the question of just does it pay to be green or does it pay to be corporate, socially responsible, but that being green depends. It depends. It recognizing that not all pro-environmental issues can be profited from. But it does raise the question, does that mean that we shouldn't do them? And there are some instances in which I would argue that it may mean not engaging in an environmental practice. So this idea of does it mean that we shouldn't engage in an environmental practice? Well, maybe if it means that engaging in that or investing in that environmental practice destroys value. And the best way to think about how it might destroy value is if it has a negative return on investment. And so one of the things that when I used to do a lot more environmental business consulting, one of the things that I talked to a lot of businesses about was this idea that maybe you shouldn't engage in this practice. Maybe you shouldn't institute a composting program. And I talked a little bit more about that in a previous lecture. So Reinhardt's 5 approaches to capturing value from environmental practices, and some of these are very similar to the discussion that we had about Porter and Kramer and Porter, or Porter and Kramer, and these Reinhardt's specific 5 approaches include differentiating products, managing competitors, cost savings and pollution prevention, managing potential risk, and redefining markets. So let's go through each of these in a little bit more detail here. So when we talk about differentiating products, we're talking about companies creating products or employees' processes that offer greater environmental benefits or impose smaller environmental costs than those of the competitors. And so it's this idea that if you can differentiate your product through an environmental practice or a greener process, that may raise your production costs, but it also can lead to greater value creation. And part of the appeal of this is that there's increasing demand from consumers for green products and services. And an interesting anecdote about demand for greener products or services is that the marketing research seems to suggest that the closer the product is to your body, the more consumers are willing to pay for a greener product or service. And this light bulb really clicked for me when I was looking at desired green practices for hotels, and by far the green feature or green amenity that was most demanded or most enjoyed by hotel guests were the bathroom amenities. And we see this again. We see this, the area in which we've seen the highest growth for green products has been for foods. That sustainable foods is much stronger or much more robust than other areas. Reinhart talks about the important caveat to differentiating your product through environmental practices, and he says that it's dependent on three conditions. The first is that there is an identifiable demand, that there's that the market sees value in that environmental practice, and there may be a situation in which there's a way to reduce your environmental impact, but consumers don't see that as any sort of value creation, or stakeholders more broadly don't see that as being particularly salient. In which case, selling your product at a higher cost of production but lower, or the same level of demand is unlikely to be successful. You also have to have an ability to communicate the differentiation. So you have to be able to talk about the product's environmental benefits with some level of credibility. So this gets to the idea of greenwashing, that just saying that it's a green product or service, that customers may be particularly weary of that. And so if you're unable to communicate that environmental orientation to your consumers, it's unlikely to really allow you to differentiate your product or service. And then finally, you have to be able to protect that differentiation from imitation for long enough to earn a return on investment. So if it's going to be very easy for your competitors to copy you or implement that initiative or practice at a lower cost than it does for you, that it's unlikely to be sustainable in the long run, or sustainable long enough to recoup the initial investments that you made. So this differentiating products or services is kind of, I think, the most intuitive of the strategies, and one that I think makes sense to a lot of us. One that's a little bit more interesting or maybe less intuitive is the managing competitors. So this idea of working to change the rules of the game so that the playing field tilts in their favor. So mitigating higher costs by making competitors pay even more. So this idea of creating a situation, while it might cost you more to build a energy efficient building, it's going to cost your competitors even more so to build an energy efficient building. And it's based on this question: am I better off if my competitors match my investments or if they don't? So if it's not, so then it may be better to force force the hand of your competitors more than differentiating. So if this idea is it better, if you're a construction company, is it better to be the only green business, green builder in your area, or would there be some benefits to having a group of green builders? And there may be situations in which being the only green builder may be particularly beneficial. But there may be some situations in which having many green builders in your area would be more successful for your firm. So the way that managing your competitors, different ways in which you can do this. One is establishing industry standards. The problem, though, is dealing with antitrust limitations and ensuring full compliance. So the Reinhart goes into a fair amount of detail, talking about this idea of managing competitors. If you can't make your competitors engage in the practice, then it's not going to be an effective strategy. But he talks about working through trade groups or again, this idea of making the green practice the industry standard, the way things are done. That can also be done through supporting and encouraging governmental regulations. And so this idea of lobbying in the government to have stricter environmental regulations, again, in order to make it more difficult for your competitors. The ability to manage competitors is going to depend on your ability to set measurable performance standards. This idea that if your competitors can say that they're doing something and not actually do it, that's going to make this strategy difficult. Similarly, having access to information to verify compliance, and also some way in which those who fail to meet those standards are punished. So either they're regulated by the government, or that they have some, they don't get to be part of the trade group, or denied access to certain customers, are ways through which this can happen. So it's been very interesting. The convention and visitor bureaus, convention centers, green convention centers, have kind of been pushing for this idea that more and more trade groups, if they have meetings and events, that they commit to meeting at a green venue. And part of that is this enforcement, creating a penalty for those that don't meet the standard. So another way that Reinhart talks about using environmental standards is through cost savings and pollution prevention. And it's this idea that there's some environmental practices that they don't really affect value creation, that it doesn't make for a better product or service, but the production costs are lower. And it's this idea of pollution prevention pays, which is a slogan that the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has kind of used for a number of ideas. And it's this idea that using less of a scarce resource is a way to save money on your production. So if you can produce computer chips using less water, that may save you money. If you can, the other example, or the no-brainer, is an LED exit sign. When I first got into doing green consulting for businesses, it was back when a lot of exit signs had incandescent light bulbs, and those exit signs were on every day, all day. And so if you could use a more energy efficient light bulb in those exit signs, you were immediately going to save money. So it was $50 that you would save, I think in 5 years. And so if you've got 50 LED exit signs and you're saving $50 on each one, that's $2,500 that you get to save by just changing the light bulb in your exit signs. And so it's really a no-brainer. And this raises the question, should such efforts be required? So if it is more energy efficient, or if it is more cost effective to use less resources, should we just require that all businesses do it? And the interesting point, or the interesting idea, is that corporations are actors with the best knowledge about markets, products, inputs, production processes, capital, supply chains, and available technologies. And so the reality is that if given the proper incentives, corporations can achieve greater gains than ever imagined by regulation more efficiently. But the opposite is also true, in that firms that don't take advantage of these opportunities are likely to lead to regulation. And so it's an argument that I've made kind of throughout this semester, that it's better for businesses to be ahead of environmental regulation than wait for regulations of any kind to become standard. Because if you wait until you're told how to do it, it's going to be more expensive than if you do it on your own. So another idea that Reinhart talks about is this potential for managing risk. and this idea that environmental investments are insurance policies. And we talked a little bit about this when we talked about goodwill and the benefits of goodwill and the ways in which having stocks of goodwill can help firms when there's the benefit of the doubt. But there are also other risks, kind of knowable risks that we can think about in which being environmentally proactive can be helpful for. So this includes things like regulatory risk. We've talked about this, the laggard or the leaders. There's also supply chain risks. So there can be huge costs if you have a substitution or need to change your supplier to meet compliance. There's litigation risks, so the lawsuits, from not meeting regulation. The reputational risks, and there are also physical risks. So dealing with environmental disasters can be quite expensive for firms. So kind of addressing those risks or mitigating the probability of those risks can be hugely important. And so we talked a little bit about that when we talked about the ski resorts kind of being proactive on climate change, in part because if the climate continues to warm, it's going to be more and more expensive for ski resorts to operate. And so ski resorts recognize that while they alone cannot solve the climate change problem, they can reduce the probability through their own actions. And so there's incentive for ski resorts to be more, have smaller carbon footprints. And then finally, there's the redefining markets, and so this is redefining business models that reduce environmental impact while increasing value for customers. So this idea of one of the more interesting examples of this have been the selling the function of a product rather than the product itself, turning the products into services. And so Reinhardt in the article talked about Xerox, but there's also been huge advances in this model in office carpeting, commercial equipment, commercial kitchen equipment, and this allows for opportunities to leverage advanced supply chains and logistics, and creates market opportunities for firms in places where there were none before, and creating more value for consumers while also having a lower negative environmental impact. And so the other idea is planning for secondary and tertiary uses, turning waste into feedstock. So it's focusing on value creation rather than value capture. So when we think about these alternative models, again, the focus is on value creation, value rather than value capture. And this theme that hopefully you guys have picked up on is that firms that capture value without creating it are inherently unsustainable. And so that firms, when we're talking about effective strategy, that really that we have to think about what's the value that's being created. So how do we put these things into action? What are some kind of models that we can think about or tips here? So part of it is thinking broadly when identifying opportunities, but keeping the focus on core competencies. So is office recycling program a good idea? And as I've kind of mentioned a few times during this lecture, if it doesn't take away from focusing on your core competency, it might be a great thing to do. But if you are allocating resources that could be used more efficiently somewhere else, then you start engaging in value destruction, or not creating as much value as you potentially could, and those are strategies that you want to avoid. And so while it's great to see an accounting firm where once a year all of their employees participate in a Habitat for Humanity Day, is that really the best use of those employees' time? Maybe a better use of their time would be spending the day, providing accounting advice for low-income individuals. Or maybe it's thinking about ways in which accounting firms in general can reduce their paper use. Again, leveraging your core competencies in order to create value. And that's not to say that the Habitat for Humanity program is inherently bad. I think there's some nice things that can come out of it. There's some team building type things. There's that feeling of doing something good, doing something physical. Just changing the context sometimes can be hugely powerful. But I would encourage you to think about doing things that really leverage your core competency, and using that as a way to reduce your environmental impact. Related to this is every company has to identify the unique ways in which they create green value. So what's the culture, time horizon, resources, and context in which you're operating in? And there may be different ways in which different firms can meet these goals. So there's not one size fits all. There's not one green practice that every firm should or shouldn't be doing. It really depends on where your organization is. And related to that is developing a vision for how environmental practices connect with your firm's strategy and performance. This idea of how are we going to measure our environmental impact? What are the ways in which we're going to track and improve and get better at these things if it's important for our firm? Also recognizing that learning how to go green can mitigate risks, that there are a number of risks that firms face, and maybe going green, as we talked about, is a way to mitigate some of those risks. And this idea that strong sustainability efforts often lead to innovation. And this is this interesting, this interesting idea that a number of people have written a lot about, is that oftentimes it's when we're facing the greatest challenges that we come up with the best ideas. And so some of these unsolvable environmental problems are spaces in which we can come up with some really innovative ideas, which can be excellent business opportunities for different firms. And the final thing is done right, going green should make your company more efficient and a better place to work, driving value creation and value capture opportunities. And I think that's a good point to kind of end the semester on, in kind of our discussion about business ethics. Is that business ethics is one of these things that if it's done right, it should make your business better. That it should make your business more profitable. It should improve your relationship with stakeholders. And the problem becomes that we start to justify unethical behavior because of short-term gains. That it seems like it's the right thing to do because it's going to help in the short term. And how we define short-term and long-term is going to differ for any individual situation. But the evidence seems pretty clear that people don't like to associate themselves with bad actors, and so there's a reason to try and think about these things. And hopefully this semester we've talked about different ways in which we can think about these things through the different frameworks and different models of ethical decision making. And hopefully we've talked about a few of the key areas in which these questions typically come up. So it's been a real pleasure and joy preparing and doing this class with you all this semester. We've got the exam and the individual case analysis due here at the end of the semester. If you have any questions or comments or want me to look over your individual case analysis, I'd be more than happy to if the time permits. But if not, look forward to reading your final assignments here, and I hope everyone has a wonderful summer.